This week on Portrait of an Artist, Rosemary Peters introduces us to Donald DeLue, a sculptor from Monmouth County who is world-renowned.
My mother that was responsible for it. She took me to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and into the sculpture section, which consisted of the tombs of the Medici by Michelangelo and some very fine Greek works from Pergamon, and also two huge equestrian statues about 25 foot high, all in white plaster. That so impressed me when I was about 12 years of age that I decided at that moment there was nothing else in the world I wanted to be but a sculptor. My mother, who thought that I drew very well, took many of my drawings to the Boston Museum of Fine Art and showed them to some people. And then there was a very fine sculptor in Boston by that name of Bela Pratt, who was doing some fine work. He looked at the drawings and he said, certainly the young boy has talent, and he should go into a studio, but he's too young to go to art school. So therefore they put me into a private studio with a very fine young sculptor who began to teach me the art of sculpture and how to go about it. A man by the name of Richard Reckier, of whom is 95 years of age at the present time and still working.
Were there any other influences on your work in those early years?
Yes, over the years there were, but my father was very strongly opposed to it. He thought that it was rather left for women and things of that kind rather than for men, and he was interested in steel and things of that nature. Yes, when I was working for this sculptor, Richard Reckier, they came to the studio one day, two young men who knocked at the door and asked if they might come in. And they hadn't been in a sculptor studio for a long time, and would it be all right? So I asked Mr. Reckier if they could come in. He said, by all means. They came in, they sat down and they talked, and they were dressed a little differently. It turned out that they were two young Englishmen that had come across the continent, and they had been to the 1914, 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco. So during the conversation, they said they were going to open up a studio in Boston. Would Mr. Reckier be willing to release me to them as a student? And he apparently was very glad to do it. So I started out a new life, actually working at this time for about $6 a week for these two young Englishmen. So I was only about 14 at this time, and I was supposed to be going to high school, but I was not going to high school. I was playing hooky. So that's how I started.
The lesson to be learned from that is that sometimes playing hooky is productive.
It was very productive, yes.
Much of your sculpture is of historic figures and mythical figures. Did your interest in history precede these commissions, or did your work tend to?
I think it was a little of both. Having seen the Medici tombs and the Greek sculpture at the Boston Museum, I began going to the library and getting books on sculpture. And of course, a great deal of it had to do with classical sculpture at that time, as there wasn't actually any other kind of sculpture, except in Gothic and things of that nature. So as I began to read and study the background of sculpture, of course, I found it as Greek and Egyptian, sort of things of that kind. And of course, very later into the Italian Renaissance, which I became, I should say by the time I was 15 or 16, I was an avid reader of things of this type. and was fascinated by Michelangelo, also fascinated by the history of the ancient world, and the meaning of Greece and so forth and so on. And it had always intrigued me the fact that so many of these so-called young heroes of Greece were willing to sacrifice a life at such an early age in order really to become famous people and go down to history as important personages, as so much of that history is myth and also history. And I began to study it a great deal, and I began to draw a great deal, and to model a great deal in Mr. Recchia's studio, where I was, in the Baker studio now, which was very different. They had music, the first that I probably ever heard, because there wasn't much more than the phonograph in those days. They had operas which they played, so I began into a brand new world, which did not exist in Boston at that time. And it became very enlightening to me, so therefore I developed, I think, pretty much along classical lines, and also being very conscious of the history that caused it. Before starting any piece of sculpture, I generally make any number of drawings. It may run as much as 8 or 9 sketches, and these just happen to be 3, and I think I've made considerably more than that for this figure, which I'm calling Aurora, or the Dawn. Different ideas, and just to familiarize myself with the form which I'm going to use. I very seldom use models, and find that I can, of course, these figures for females are fairly anatomical, but however, they're part of the business of making sculpture, because of the knowledge of the anatomical knowledge has to be there, which of course just covered by flesh. But on the other hand, if you don't have the knowledge, you don't have much in the way of a figure. Here I have a drawing of the beginning of a football player, the figure fairly nude but slightly clothed, which is the beginning. And onto this metal armature, which is aluminum wire, I now take my clay and I build the form of this particular football player, which is eventually going to be a football player. I'm now putting the clay on, and it does also, as soon as it begins to develop a little bit, it will go on in a general muscular structure. The chest will be made, so forth and so on, the back, spine, hips, etc. It'll take me a little time to do this, but this is the process of making a figure, either large or small. The principle is the same. This is really a start of a very inconspicuous figure. I'm not even so sure that I'm going to do it, but I laid it out on this board and I worked on the clay, and it's supposed to be a figure of Job, who was in the Bible was inflicted with various diseases and so forth, and unpleasantness and so forth and so on. And finally he overcame his affliction, and of course became the beloved of the Lord, and prospered and had a family again and great wealth and so forth and so on. And as I suppose there's an object lesson in it, that we all have to put up with a certain amount of discomfiture and hopefully gain a better future. So this figure is just in a very formative stage, and it is still, I'm not quite convinced that I will continue with it, but still I'm working on it. And I have Job here, and the only sign that he has that he might possibly come out of this in a better state of mind, I put a star here which was on his bed, which he's looking at the star, and hopefully hoping that the results of the star will bring him the health that he seeks. But it still is in a very, very elementary stage. I keep putting the clay on rather than take it off, because it's continually constructive. And I just pulled up in size and proportion, hopefully to the size that is going to be most pleasant to my sight. But it is all built with the understanding and muscular knowledge of the subject.
Did this start with a drawing?
Yes, I started with a drawing to some degree, but this one was just actually a lump of clay laying on this board, and I actually began pushing it around, and this figure evolved. And it evolved so easily that I just wondered what it was worthwhile proceeding with, because I generally give things a lot more attention than that.
This one needs to be born, I think.
Pardon?
I said this one needs to be born.
This one needs to be born, yes. This one needs to be born because it's had very little consideration. This is a small piece of which I'm doing for myself rather than a commission. And I have close by a figure called the North Star. And this is to be a complementary figure. This, of course, is a female figure, and the other is a male. And this is to represent the dawn. The poetic term for the dawn is the aurora. But this is to be the dawn, and she's either to carry the symbol of the sun or probably a star within her hand, one way or the other, to symbolize what she really means. And therefore, it's supposed to be it is a symbol of joy, of a beginning of a new day. And it's the female, for the reason that female figures are generally given the significance of great importance. For example, the Statue of Liberty, for example, is an example of justice, and all these different things are generally represented by female figures. Therefore, the female figure has a great deal of symbolism, as well as other beauties and other joys.
Could you tell me about the type of clay that you use and the properties that it has?
This is an Italian clay. It's made in Italy, and it's made of sulfur and olive oil. And this clay, what I'm working on now, is 100 years or more in age. It was part of this clay, in fact, most of the clay that I have of this kind was in the statue of Sherman, which is in front of the Plaza Hotel in New York. And this clay was used in that statue in about 1900. And so it was old at the time that I bought it. And it reasonably could be said as at least 100 years or more in age.
Do you have a favorite piece of sculpture among all of the pieces that you've done?
Yes, I do. I think one of them is most pleasing to me is the one at Omaha Beach in Normandy, as it was a commission that I regarded of considerable importance. It was also, I think the United States built something like 16 of these memorials in Italy in Europe after WW2. And of course we had considerable loss of life over there. And in many cases the families did not wish to have the bodies of these young men returned. I was asked to make a design that would be fitting to it, and it also offered a problem because there was Army, Navy, and Air Force. And of course that would call for three different figures that would represent them. And I decided that perhaps it would be something better to have something more symbolic that could involve all three. And as a matter of fact, I did have to talk to some of the military people, and they informed me that some of them informed me that it was rather important that I remember that there would be certain military decorations and medals that would have to go on any uniform which was used. So I spent some time, and I think I designed something like, I made a general model of an ark, which was the model colonnade, in which there was a figure about 25 feet high to stand in front of it. And I decided that perhaps, well, I knew that there were 19,000 American, British, and Canadian dead buried out in front of it. And obviously there was no life in any of those bodies. And if the Christian religion meant anything at all, there was a risen soul, in other words, a surviving soul. So I designed this figure as on a wave over which they came, and rising, as a body rising up toward the heavens. And this design was finally accepted by the three services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And of course, there was no place to pin any medals because this was a nude figure, a nude male figure. But it was a symbol of the spirit that lives on.
There's a lot of controversy over the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington. Do you have any strong feelings about it one way or the other?
Yes, I do. I don't like it at all. I think it's degrading the veterans of Vietnam. I think that they fought as noble a war as anybody ever could. They were under orders. They were doing what they were supposed to do. I think it was very badly run. Now, I've had no part in the Vietnam War, but I did spend considerable time at Fort Bragg, for the Green Beret, that is the Special Services, and I spent weeks with those men because I did a memorial to them, and I did learn firsthand how badly this war was being run. and that we really had no intention of winning it, which is also another thing. And of course, to fight a war which you don't intend to win is wrong, and sacrifice of these lives. Right in this very room here, the general of the Green Beret said, "Mr. DeLue, we are not going to win this war." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the politicians will not permit it." And I said, "What would be the difference? The military are handling it." He said, "If I were allowed to handle this war, within 2.5 weeks there would be no war. It would be all over." He said, "The Vietnamese would be so busy trying to stay alive, there wouldn't be any war." So therefore, I do feel that the design, I think the design at Washington that was approved was not a good design. It denigrates those veterans who fought in that war. They wanted a memorial which would memorialize it in the sense that most have been memorialized with dignity. And on the other hand, it was dark in color, which is a symbol of death. It was in a trench, it would be buried, and it had no constructive emphasis of any kind. In other words, it was trying to bury something. And the veterans who fought in that war fought with all the nobleness and the ability that any Americans had ever fought in any war. So they were being turned down, actually.
Your sculptural figures are larger than life, both in size and in feeling. What are the ideas that you're trying to express in these figures?
My people are almost super people. They're strong, and I hope noble. I hope that they have sound ideas and so forth and so on. But they're conceived on the basis of such as the rocket thrower, which is powerful, and it symbolizes man's from very ancient times desire to get into space. I figured that man's entry into space was one of the most important things up to our time, and it was uniting the power and the thought of man getting into space himself, and it was through power and energy. In other words, it would be a super person who would get into space. Therefore, I built the rocket thrower as a symbol of power. Power both for the mind that thinks it, for the body that would do it. And therefore, I made it as powerful as I possibly could, without being ridiculous.
What do you think sculpture at its best can do for civilization, for individuals?
I think that I can go back to the early beginnings of sculpture. Sculpture was in the beginning, from the very beginning, was to memorialize somebody or some deed, or something that they had done or executed, something that they had done well. And a man might be honored because he turned out to be a fine governor, politician. He might be honored because he was a soldier, had been a victor in a war, or he might be a poet who had written a beautiful song or something of that nature. But man has always memorialized his fellow man to give credit to him for having accomplished something. And that's the principle that I still adhere to, that man does memorialize his brother or himself, whomever it may be, by erecting a monument so those who come in years to come will recognize and know about this person, whose name will not be lost.